University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. Her recent publications include Studying Language and Interaction, a practical research guide to communicative repertoire and social linguistic diversity, Routledge 2023, How We Talk About Language, Exploring Citizen Social Linguistics 2020, and Classroom Discourse Analysis, a Tool for Critical Reflection 2016. Thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the really warm welcome and for inviting me to participate in this a long time ago. I'm just going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint to sort of guide the talk. I guess I want to start also by saying thank you for providing this opportunity to kind of collect my thoughts. I feel like in this little talk that I'm about to give, I've had a chance to collect a lot of the sort of wisdom of my colleagues, my friends, and my students, and sort of mix it all together and see how it relates to the things that I like to think about too, and maybe keep thinking in this way, ideally, collectively. All right, so I really I see this PowerPoint that I'm about to talk through as a way of just leading into the longer discussion that we're going to have today. And this is the basic outline. First, just saying what I mean by discourses of appropriateness. Many of you are probably familiar with these discourses. I'll just be calling them DAs. So I'll talk through sort of 8 extremely wide-ranging examples of what I think of are DAs, discourses of appropriateness in action, and then start, I hope, a discussion about how do we move beyond discourses of appropriateness. I have some ideas, and I'm sure everybody in this Zoom call does too. So first off, what are discourses of appropriateness? Well, they may take this form. Your language is not appropriate here, or your accent is not appropriate here. Even your intonation is not appropriate here, or even a specific word is not appropriate here. So that might be, and often they're couched as doing the person a favor by telling them that. These are language ideologies, that is, they're claims about ways of speaking that point to contexts in which language of various kinds should or should not be used, and by whom, and based on imagined forms of language and imagined categories of people. I feel that these are very parallel to Benedict Anderson's discussion of imagined communities. Like his term, imagined communities, the label of appropriate for ways of speaking doesn't describe objective realities about language, but it is itself a cultural artifact, and it's built on imagined scenarios. But okay, even though these scenarios of appropriate speaking are imagined, they're also powerful. And this is why I like the comparison to Anderson's imagined communities. For Anderson, imagined communities naturalize nation-state allegiances across huge swaths of people who do not know each other and probably never will. And these feelings of nation-state allegiances even motivate the willingness to die for one's imagined community or one's country. So similarly, imagined scenarios of appropriateness naturalize categories of people and of competence, with marginalized people sometimes making great sacrifices to uphold and legitimize established hierarchy. So what counts as an appropriate way of speaking is always shifting according to context, according to the people interacting, and according to infinite other emergent factors. There's no recipe, there's no one-to-one correspondence between what people say and that's right for which context. So this appropriate way of speaking is a moving target, or Fairclough has called a domain of hegemonic struggle. People are always working through these. So I'm going to begin our journey through examples by highlighting two poles of this moving target of appropriateness, neither of which have much to do with the actual language being spoken. One pole is stuff always appropriate, ways of speaking that always count as appropriate because of the speaker's perceived place of privilege in the established hierarchy. And then at the other extreme, ways of speaking that are never appropriate. Ways of speaking can never be appropriate because the speaker's perceived place of lower privilege in the established hierarchy, which may be due to race, class, gender, nation of origin, clothing, stance, career, sneakers, age, eyebrows, it could be anything. But that person is deemed not appropriate in the way they're speaking. So let's just go through some extremely simplistic and very artistic line drawings here for a moment. Starting at home. Now, home is a place people talk about a lot in terms of appropriateness, and home is imagined as always okay. You can do whatever you want in terms of language at home, people often say. So you can say, hola, mi amor, and that's appropriate if at your home. You can say, hi, my love, in English, that's also appropriate. It gets more tricky when you're out in public, maybe at a university, say. This person says, hola, mi amor, and this response might happen. English, please. So in this case, it's not appropriate to say, hola, mi amor. In this case, though, this is the person who was speaking English at home. They say, hola, mi amor, and this is very impressive. Wow, you speak Spanish. So in this case, speaking Spanish in public is always appropriate because it's this person, this angelic person speaking. And in this case, it even counts as markedly sophisticated. So what changed between these two frames? The top one where their speech is not appropriate, and the bottom one where it's totally appropriate. The language didn't change, the context didn't change, but the person speaking did change. So some people are heard as always appropriate speakers, and some are never. In such cases, appropriate language is a tacit proxy for an appropriate person or not appropriate person. So this is a form of hegemony of infinite variety. And I want to emphasize that today because I think that really opens up the discussion about, and so something you might think about is the example I just gave is sort of the one in gray here of a white US citizen speaking, oops, my cat. A white US citizen speaking Spanish might always seem appropriate and even cosmopolitan, but a Puerto Rican US citizen speaking Spanish might even be perceived as languageless. This Spanish is never appropriate in a public space. But I think this, you can see by this long list of examples that this occurs in many different ways. Like men apologizing might always be appropriate, but women apologizing often that's considered a sign of weakness or a way of not getting ahead. Men saying just is fine, but women are criticized for saying just as being too, deferential, hedging too much, even though the Nike slogan, just do it, is precisely the opposite. Using one's European mother tongue might always be appropriate, but using one's non-European mother tongue, never appropriate. International students at a university using multiple forms of English might be always appropriate. That seems like what university students do. But international US university students using multiple forms of English is seen as problematic, never appropriate. So you get the idea, and I'll go on to a couple more examples. Spelling bees, hip hop, writing, those also illustrate the always and never appropriate poles. So let's think this through with women's language advice. Now, as Deborah Cameron has written, women's language is endlessly police. Here's some advice that she lists to women. You should stop apologizing, stop using the word just, stop using excessive body language, but do copy men's body language. Stop speaking in a high-pitched voice, Stop using uptalk, stop using vocal fry, stop appending tag questions. You know what I mean, isn't it? So these are the types of advice women get as ways to they could speak more appropriately and actually get ahead. It's often framed as liberatory for women. If you get rid of these women's habits, you'll get more access to power, otherwise elusive due to this apologetic stance, using just, having vocal fry, or using uptalk. So what's implied is that talk like a man and you will have all the attendant privileges of men. But what is also true is that men often speak in all the ways that women are told to avoid. So as Mary Beth Seitz Brown puts it, criticizing women's language, their intonation, their vocal fry, all these other things, implies that if women just spoke like men, our ideas would be valuable. If women just spoke like men, sexist listeners would magically understand us and we would be taken seriously. But the problem is not with feminized qualities or speech or otherwise. The problem is that our culture pathologized feminine traits as something to be ashamed of or apologize for. Men are not more successful in the workplace because of the way they speak, but because of their position in the established hierarchy. So men saying just do it or just give me a minute skews to always appropriate, and women's use of the same language to never. Just never say just, and stop apologizing and you'll be more appropriate. Okay, so white male language is never policed to the same degree that women's language is policed. And similarly, in the United States, white people's English, warts and all, is never policed the way that Black people's language is. So African American Vernacular English, or AV, also called Black English or even Ebonics, is recognized and debated as to its appropriateness in various settings. But WAVE, White American Vernacular English, is not even a thing. It's not talked about, nor really is White English, or nobody has ever coined the portmanteau Ivoryonics. And nobody talks about that form of appropriateness. In the US, white people speaking English is the unmarked category. So we imagine that white people always speak perfectly in the same way at home and in public. But Black people speaking English are a marked category. And so we see a need to label their speech. AV, Black English, BE, or Ebonics are some of those labels. However, white people, like all people, do not always speak the same way. Often quirky lists of pet peeves may call attention to white English language variation. But even those holders of pet peeves are often called names like grammar mavens or even grammar Nazis for calling out these things. Nobody collects these words together and calls them wave and says they're appropriate in some situations, but not in others. And I often hear and see many of these words or pet peeves in the halls of academia. It's no problem. I freely admit I like to use the word literally in figurative ways. I literally died yesterday in the heat. I love literally that way, but nobody corrects me or says it's not appropriate. So in contrast, AV, or forms of African American Vernacular English, like women's language, has been studied by linguists for decades and decreed a systematic named alternative. So just as women have been instructed to stop apologizing, stop using just or having vocal fry or uptalk, African Americans have been instructed to code switch from African American Vernacular English to an imagined form of appropriate English for their own good, to gain access to power and success. So code switch is a speech act normalized in many schools in Philadelphia. And it's documented at one alternative school here by a student of mine, Sydney Nagus. Students often hear that they need to code switch from AV to more appropriate English in school. But some tension was also identified by one teacher at this alternative school. And she points out that sometimes this feels like asking students to be white. She says, I don't want students to not be themselves. I want you to be you. I want you to be the best version of you. And we talk about code switching, but I think it's, very bluntly, I've just had students say, well, I feel like when I go into these spaces, I need to act white. So saying code switch to African American students, just like saying stop apologizing to women, becomes a comment on the person, not simply the appropriateness of the language. It seems like a criticism rather than a pragmatic step for getting ahead. And as Negus writes about the practice at this school, code switching sets up a dichotomy between professional and home. And without more explicit discussion of context and society, this dichotomy can lead to unintentionally negative messages to the students about themselves. So code switch, although it seems to be talking about language, is actually minimally about the language, but maximally about the person speaking. So white people get to be appropriate all the time, but Black people need to code switch. Again, what changed in these frames? Not the language, not the context, but the person speaking. So often some people are heard as never appropriate speakers, some are not. So not appropriate language becomes tacit proxy for not an appropriate person. So white people do not get ahead because of their perfect language, but because they're already on top of an established hierarchy. They say literally, or they even say, ain't nobody got time for that. And this skews to always appropriate. But Black people in the United States, using the same language, will skew to never appropriate. Now let's think of another case of, I think, a code switch dynamic that seems to be occurring in Europe. And this is where discussion will probably help me. So Rob Moore, hopefully still here, has written about this mother tongue +2 policy as described in the Maloof report, which was written by a group of intellectuals to address the increasing linguistic diversity in Europe and to face, quote, the problem of preventing cultural diversity from having a negative impact on harmonious coexistence within European societies. So in this report, mother tongue is held up as something important, even non-European mother tongues. They write, it's vital for the countries of Europe to understand how important it is for every immigrant or person originating from immigration to maintain knowledge of their language or origin. And to this mother tongue, each person is supposed to add 2 other languages, a personal adopted language from the country in which they have chosen to live, and then also a language of international commerce, which might just be lingua franca English, or this would be for utilitarian considerations. But I want to focus on these 2, the mother tongue and the personal adopted language. The authors provide an extended description of how they would like to see knowledge of this European language distributed among European citizens in the future, but very little about how these future Europeans would actually be using the language they know. This is what Rob Moore points out. But to me, it also seems that they have relegated one type of mother tongue, the non-European, to home only, that always safe place, and another mother tongue, European languages, as a potential language of bilateral engagement. So somebody from a non-European country has a mother tongue that is non-European. So say they decided to live in Germany, their language of bilateral engagement would be their new language. But apparently, I guess this seems like mother tongue becomes a proxy for non-European language, and non-European language seems to be a proxy for non-European person, because mother tongue doesn't seem to be referring to people who already live in Europe. So speaking one's mother tongue in bilateral interaction is only appropriate for those whose mother tongue is European, where it might also be used at home. But speaking one's mother tongue, if it's non-European, is only appropriate at home. So I guess a European person might speak their mother tongue, say it's German, and then their +1 would be Italian. but nobody's going to catch them out if they're speaking German for bilateral engagement. But somebody whose mother tongue is non-European, in public, they're supposed to speak this adopted language of where they now live. So even though the authors of the Maloof report speak to the power of language diversity, Moore calls this a form of reactionary multilingualism. And he identifies a dynamic that attempts to, he says, close the door on immigration-based and other complex form of language diversity. To me, this seems like a European version of the code switch dynamic. So a mother tongue is crucial, but in public, speaking a European mother tongue is always appropriate. And speaking a non-European mother tongue is never appropriate, since this cannot be a language of what they call bilateral interaction. So European mother tongue always skews, always appropriate. Non-European mother tongue always skews, non-appropriate. And I'm not even sure if they would consider well, anyway. Okay, back in the USA, there's another approach to contain linguistic diversity, a different dynamic, similarly couched in terms of appropriateness. So Jonathan Rosa describes in detail how institutional policy makes its way through one high school in Chicago and leads to the designation of bilingual students as speaking not two languages, but less than one language, since only English ability was assessed. So in this conversation, Rosa, he's JR here, expresses his astonishment that in a school population made up of primarily kids who speak both English and Spanish, the principal, DB here, counts only 89 students as bilingual. So the principal says, we have 900 and something total students, but only 89 are bilingual. Rosa says, come on. He can't believe she's saying that. Yes. What does that mean? They're bilingual. Oops. They're bilingual. That means they don't know the language. The other ones just don't want to speak it. Jonathan, no, when I say bilingual, oh, so you're saying there are only 89 who speak English and Spanish? No, there are only 89 who need help. Jonathan, who are English language learners. Right. Oh, okay, so we're talking about two different things. Right. So Rosa continues to unpack this and points out that because of bureaucratic and fiscal demands associated with the transitional bilingual program at this school, bilingual is equated with limited English proficiency. This is a dynamic I completely remember from my own teaching in Los Angeles, where bilingual means limited English proficiency also, often due to fiscal arrangements. So and also in their article on undoing appropriateness, Flores and Rosa discuss a similar dynamic in New York City schools, where bilingual students are often classified as long-term English learners, despite being able to easily use both English and Spanish across many contexts. So, like non-European languages of immigrants of Europe, Spanish doesn't count as a public language. Unless, and this brings us back to the original example, the speaker is already a privileged person. So Rosa describes high school language academies in Chicago, in other neighborhoods, primarily serving white students that celebrate the cosmopolitan multilingualism of the primarily English-speaking students there. And he writes, unlike the overall dynamics or demographics of CPS, that's the Chicago Public Schools, schools designated as language academies often have far fewer low-income students and far more white students. So knowing Spanish does not give you an advantage. Being a white person already able to attend a magnet school with a language academy does. Again, those attending language academies, white students speaking Spanish, skew always appropriate in their Spanish use, but others, people speaking Spanish, that signifies that they are limited English speakers. Never appropriate. So what about higher education? How does linguistic diversity and variation work in higher education? So Yumi Matsumoto attacks this question in her paper, Rethinking Appropriate Englishes, and she notes a familiar discourse of appropriateness regarding diversity, even in higher ed. So while there's a valuing of diversity and internationalization at the university, there's a simultaneous lament, kind of like the Malouf report, about the diverse forms of English use or inappropriate Englishes in classes and the academic work in classes, especially in classes that are filled with multilingual students from a variety of non-English speaking countries. So these students speak ELF, English as a lingua franca, among themselves, but it often may be discounted as an inappropriate form of English. So Matsumoto documents a discourse process she calls third-party participant assistance as a means for incorporating classroom ELF and negotiating meaning. This is an example that she gives of third-party participant assistance. In a classroom, a Japanese student, international student, has trouble saying the word club because of the L and the LR distinction being absent in Japanese. Then other ELF speakers, and the teacher can't understand what she's saying, but then other ELF speakers in the class who recognize what's going on repeat club for the teacher. And then the teacher frames it as her own mistake for not hearing. Sorry, my hearing is bad. And then she, the teacher, provides a candidate alternative phrasing. Oh, extracurricular? To clarify. So as Matsumoto points out, this local negotiation of meaning is powerful. She says such local communicative practices have the potential to transform the dominant ideology in US education, that multilingualism is a problem. I would argue that this use of multiple Englishes is actually something that happens in all classrooms, whether English is a lingua franca for an internationally diverse group or a native language shared by everyone in the room. So the negotiation of multiple Englishes just seems appropriate for some students and not for others. I mean, white students in a US university using multiple forms of English is pretty much the norm. And probably multiple forms of English that are very different from the teacher's forms of English. Whereas for Black and Brown, primarily Black and Brown international students, using multiple forms of English suddenly seems not appropriate. But Matsumoto's third-party negotiation of multiple Englishes is a component of effective collaborative learning, I feel like, across teachers, students, and generations for any type of student. So now you've probably been wondering this whole time, what about spelling bees? Is this the most non-imaginary possible display of linguistic expertise? How could winning a spelling bee not be appropriate for everyone? So the anthropologist Shalini Shankar has looked into this. And I don't know if you are familiar with the Scripps National Spelling Bee, but it's a big deal in the United States. And it attracts hardworking, studious A students from across the country. And for years, exclusively white children were the champions. And the bee was considered a quintessentially American event, as Shankar writes. Then, when Americans of Indian descent began to win the Scripps National Spelling Bee routinely, the public expressed bile and outrage and claimed that the winners were using un-American tactics to achieve so consistently. And the study tactics they used were those of neoliberal entrepreneurialism, developing workshops and things like that, online modules that people could take to get ahead. But these were apparently only appropriate for white participants. And a mother that Shankar interviewed for her book, Beeline, voiced her sense of the impossible double standard the Indian American community was being subjected to. Voicing the mindset of critics here, she said, they're sounding like this: we want them to learn our language, but not too well. And she added in her own voice, who's more American than someone born in New York? American in this sense clearly means Caucasian. So while white kids had been spelling champs for years without a question, always appropriate, for Indian Americans, both winning the bee and creating infrastructure like computer apps, educational systems to support more winners, these were considered inappropriate. Now, the art of graffiti takes us in the opposite direction. In contrast to spelling bee achievement, which one would think is so standardized as to always be appropriate, one might think that writing graffiti would always be inappropriate. But again, it depends on who is doing the writing. Consider the various examples pictured here. We've got sort of criminalized graffiti art, commercialized graffiti art, culturally relevant, revered graffiti art. Even this Banksy thing I just saw was on auction for an estimated $3 to $5 million. So that's something to think about. Anyway, all these discourses of appropriateness and their embedded double standards serve to maintain an established hierarchy. While one aspect of discourses of appropriateness can be explicit, like that language is not appropriate here, or code switch, a darker aspect remains implicit. That speaker is not appropriate. Then anything that speaker says becomes naturalized as inappropriate language to be explicitly corrected. So in this way, discourses of appropriateness function as the ideal tool, a vicious circle, to maintain established hierarchy. The inappropriate speaker can always be identified on the basis of their language and the need for them to become appropriate. And because appropriateness is a moving target, the inappropriate speaker may never become appropriate, no matter how they speak. Apologize, no, don't apologize, or learn Spanish, no, don't learn Spanish. And worse, marginalized people may make great sacrifices in terms of education, identity, resources, to uphold and legitimize this established hierarchy as they're trying to be a part of it. So what next? If these tacit discourses of appropriateness are talked into being, how can they be frankly talked about or talked out of? Well, I like to think of citizen sociolinguistics as an inquiry tool for doing this. We can collaboratively study the part of language that's imagined to be not appropriate, to understand why it exists and for whom, and what it really looks like in practice, not just something that happens in the home. So we can really look at how women talk, how multiple language varieties in schools work, and non-European mother tongues, multilingualism in communities and schools, international student strategies. How are these misunderstandings functioning for people? How do they experience them and talk about them? We can, like Shalini Shankar, look at the lives and language of different communities, like spelling bee families. We can look at graffiti and more, infinite possibility. But bring it back to the local, to study and engage in new forms of expertise. Like I feel like this group is all engaged in this notion of new epistemologies or Southern epistemologies. I think this aligns with the goal of citizen sociolinguists to look at new forms of expertise embedded in different communities that has a detail that speaks back to these broad claims about appropriateness and inappropriateness. And we can develop new kinds of collaboration. Like I have my students put zillions of examples online for sharing in our digital or virtual linguistic ethnography lab. We can do more collaborative ethnographies where we're collaborating with, say, the Indian American community the way that Shalini did, or new ways of teaching and learning together as linguistic ethnographers, learning to observe the world carefully. I feel like this is my role as a professor, is to teach research methods, but those methods being the practice of learning to observe the world carefully and to spell out the tacit assumptions that you learn by dwelling in a community over time, instead of imputing imagined forms of language onto that community or returning again and again to stereotyped identities. So those are some broad suggestions to get out of this vicious circle, but I would like to keep the discussion going, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rymes, for this very enlightening talk. Very, very interesting. And I'm sure it will generate a lot of discussions. I'd like to hand over to Professor Makoni to begin question Q&A with you. Yeah.
Okay, Betsy, thank you very much for this. I want you to follow me on this intellectual trip and see what it implies for your work.
Mhm.
Is it possible, in actual fact, that the discussions about discourses of appropriateness are not only restricted to language, but can be extended to discussions about dress, sexuality, religion, etc., etc.? That discourses of appropriateness, when they refer to speech, are part of a subset of a bigger discourses of appropriateness, which may range from sexuality to dress, etc., etc.
I just have to show you something, because I had this piece of paper sitting here that was like, I don't know if you can read it, but it's like a little scrawled thing that says multimodality and discourses of appropriateness.
Okay.
I don't really like the term multimodality, but I like that where you're going very much.
Okay. So this is the way I'm imagining this. That in a society where there are discourses of appropriateness as they relate to speech, it's inevitable to some extent that there will also be discourses of appropriateness as they relate to policing of people's dress, sexuality, etc., etc. In other words, the discourses of appropriateness, or in terms of speech, reinforce discourses of appropriateness in other areas of social and political life.
Mm-hmm. So you think it's like if there's a climate where we begin to accept these discourses of appropriateness, like, oh, just code switch so that you can get ahead in society, then that leads people to be more vulnerable to other discourses of appropriateness.
What I'm trying to say is that there's a sense in which these discourses of appropriateness, or okay, let me put it differently. There's this sense in which the discourses of policing, let me not call them discourses of appropriateness, because it gives them a positive tone. Let me just say, discourses of policing and social regulation reinforce each other. In a society where there is where the discourses of speech are policed, it's also likely that the discourses of dress, sexuality, etc., etc., are also policed and regulated. They mutually reinforce each other.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Now I want to continue with this. I want to take you to West Africa, then I'll take you to Southern Africa in terms of discourses of appropriateness. Where what is interesting about what you are doing is, if I apply that to those contexts, you encounter a group of African students who are assumed once in a while to be super proficient in English. And their English is regarded as inappropriate because it is an index of being Black on the outside and white in the inside. So in that case, the inappropriateness is one of being over proficient. They are overperforming.
Like the Indian spelling bee.
Yes, just like the Indian spelling bee. So what I was trying to sort of indicate is how this same phenomenon resonates in different contexts. I can't remember what that group of people is called in Ghana, but you have a similar situation in Southern Africa. These are largely students who have gone to attend schools in former what are called Model C schools, the schools which were previously reserved for white students only, right? So when they then encounter other African students, they are seen as being more proficient in English than is warranted. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Then let me move on to the issue about graffiti before I hand over to. No, let me help me think this thing through. Is your concern about the rules of appropriateness, or is your concern that the notion of rules is inappropriate?
I mean, I have to think that through carefully. I guess I understand there's a need for some rules.
Yes, okay. Okay.
Sadly enough, but yes. And that we follow them anyway. It's part of being in a society. On the other hand, I feel like the thing that strikes me most about all these cases is the double standard. You know,
Okay.
so that there's somebody who can do this very thing that's like it's not like something's being policed that's an actual thing that's wrong.
Okay.
Something's being policed that's okay for some people to do, but other people, no.
No. Okay. Let me help you find a way out of this impasse.
Yeah.
Right. What if I posit a situation like this? And I say that Betsy's concern is not so much rules, but how particular types of rules are formulated. That you are not objecting to rules generally. You are objecting to the way specific rules are formulated. That then gives you some room to say, oh yeah, in some cases, rules are benign and helpful to organize our societies. But if we formulate rules in this way, then that may not be an appropriate way of proceeding.
I think it's also a big thing about the process of, of taking up those rules. And that's where the vicious circle comes in.
Okay.
And the moving target nature of those rules.
Okay. That's fine. Let me stop here because there are a lot of questions in the chat box. And I think I'll be violating the rules of this platform if I talk too much. Okay, Edwin.
Yeah, so we have Arthur Spears and Limario, but Arthur Spears, you can go.
Yeah.
You are muted, Arthur. Arthur, you are muted.
Okay. Thanks, Betsy. A really interesting talk, and I'm glad you're working on this topic. And as you talked, I thought about how many times I've used appropriate as a given without really looking at it sideways and unpacking it. So it's really good to put this on the table, and for that, I thank you much.
Great.
I have 3 points I want to mention. And there are lots of factors involved in this, as you know well, and of course you don't have time to talk about all of them. But I want to point out 3 things. One is the notion of standard language. And appropriateness is riddled with interlinear considerations of the notion of standardness.
Yes.
For example, people in Europe speak standardized languages. They're, quote, real languages. People outside of Europe don't. So that applies directly to, for example, Mexican Spanish heritage speakers whose Spanish is considered non-standard. And Mike Mann, I'll mention his name. He just from the CUNY Graduate Center talks about a language elsewhere. Brown students who have a heritage Spanish that is not European Spanish are considered not to speak Spanish because it's not a standard Spanish. It's some agglomeration of non-standard utterances, ungrammatical, et cetera, the way it's seen. So I just wanted to put that into it. The other thing is writing. there's a double standard. And I'll mention quickly, and I'm sure this is still true today. One of the things that I noticed that is in some professors' classes, matter how many jumps and flips and acrobatic moves I did, I could not get an A on papers. Once I got a B, and I went to what I'll call a golden boy, a white guy with blonde hair who was thought very brilliant and so forth. And I said, "Can I see your paper? I got a B, and I think it's an A paper." So I looked at his paper. It didn't have the dates, the names, the summaries, the analyses, and so on and so forth that we were asked to do in the exam essay. And he says, "Obviously, this is a much better paper." Went to a couple of other students. They all said the same thing. So I gathered the papers and my paper, and I went to the professor. This happened various times throughout my academic career. Oh, professor, why did I get a B and these students got an A? And I think it's pretty obvious that I have much more detailed analysis, evaluation, et cetera, than they do. And what was their response? A purple face. I had never seen people turn purple, not red, but purple. And that was my response, and I never got an answer, but something that was gibberish. It may not have even been language as we know it. So this is true of language too. You can't win for trying. It's inappropriate. It's a B paper or less because of what you look like and who you are. The third thing is race, of course, is just permeating this whole discussion. One of the comments I want to make, and that I make in a lot of my papers about race, is whiteness itself is gradient. And we have to remember that there is white and there is off-white. And if you are off-white, for example, you're from the Deep South and you have a Southern accent, as did a fellow student when I was in graduate school. It was my first graduate school, which was very corporate establishment oriented. And he was sort of shunned. Was from Georgia. He didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes, which might have been something of a saving grace. And he had pronounced Southern accent. Actually, he did what he felt he had to do to fix the problem and went through an accent reduction. He had no accent whatsoever by the time we graduated. So he was off-white. Got rid of his Southern accent in order to become white. And there's even another little detail to this. The students from Virginia, I'm talking about white students, from fine old Virginia families, quote unquote, kept their patrician Virginia accents because they felt that it was white as any white accent. So they were given a pass, but not those from Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and so on and so forth. So there's writing and standard and the gradients of whiteness. And those are the 3 points I wanted to bring in.
Those are all such great points. And I love the details. I feel like this is sort of like the meat of the whole thing. Once you get into the details, you can't fall back on these like imagined categories of like appropriate people or language or other things. And I just have to add, like I did teach at the University of Georgia for a long time, and my students would say, I think this aligns with sort of your description of the ones who liked the Southern sort of genteel quality of being a Southern person. They said, "Oh, Dr. Rymes, there's Southern accent, and then there's Southern belle." Like the Southern belle was the kind that's fine. But I feel like this has to do with something that Fairclough also I feel like Fairclough originally made this argument about appropriateness in a discussion of like class in the school system in the UK, that people would sort of identify working class ways of speaking, but often it was an imaginary form of standardization that was the target, because the upper class, I mean, the whole ways the policies were worded. I wish I could pull an actual example out of my head right now, but themselves were riddled with non-standardish type of ways of using language. But it was a way of, I guess, policing language to maintain the class structure. It seems like maybe that's something happening in these like different versions of Off-White also. I don't know. But thank you for your comments. They're all super helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you too. Lynn Mario has a question or comment.
Yeah, it's basically a comment. Thank you for that presentation, Betsy. First, let me say where I'm speaking from. I'm speaking from São Paulo, Brazil, but I'm also speaking from a life experience of having grown up in the UK. And I identify with your spelling bee people because I am also of Indian descent, way back, but I am. And one of the things that I've been struggling with in my own work in applied linguistics in the last few years is how something that Arthur just mentioned, how race is left out of the issue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, back in 2018, Bernard Spolsky mentioned the importance of what he called non-linguistic elements in language choice, but he didn't go. He mentioned a little bit about colonization there, but he didn't go very much into depth into it. But he already raises the flag of the importance of non-linguistic, and here I'm using this in inverted commas. Because non-linguistic gives the impression that it's not language and therefore it's some kind of non-entity outside language, right? But these, in my work, I've been talking about the importance in terms of colonization, and the importance of bringing the body back, meaning that we have to bring the bodies of our speaking subjects back into place to understand what's happening here, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just a question of language, as you're referring to in Rosa's research, for example. It's not a question of a subject speaking, but it's a question of the race of the subject speaking, right?
Absolutely.
So here I'm referring to what Ramon Groth-Vogel calls epistemic racism, right? Where epistemic racism is, as he defines it, is the privileging of certain forms of language, being, and knowledge and culture, etc., over others.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this was my experience of growing up in the UK, where being a UK citizen, being a native speaker of English, my English was still never good enough. So it's not, you know, we have the impression that, okay, it may be a privileging of monolingualism against multilingualism, right? Because multilingualism represents otherness.
Yeah.
But there is a racist dimension to this. And here I'm using the race in racism, as you referred to in the case of appropriateness and in the case of nation, as defined by Anderson. Race, like appropriateness, normativity, and nation are all imagined, but they are extremely powerful.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So what happens is that it's not enough to be monolingual and to speak using the standard and all the appropriacy if race is an element in a society which, let's call it a colonial society, which has a hierarchy not only of language and appropriateness, but also of race, right? So it's not simply a question of speaking appropriately. It's a question, as you mentioned, also of who is speaking appropriately, right?
Yeah.
So it's what's interesting here is that now on the perspective, Sintry mentioned the idea of overachievement, right?
Yeah.
Overachievement is, when we look at it from the perspective of fellow non-whites, right? They may be looking at a non-white who speaks like a white as an overachiever, or being all of these terms that we mentioned, a melon, a coconut, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But if we look at it from the point of the dominant group, the hegemonic group, well, let's say the colonial group, in my terms, then what we have is an interesting thing, which is raised by Fanon and also by Lewis Gordon's reading of Fanon, where he says there's a double bind, and you use the term double bind. There's a double bind in trying to master the language of mastery.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
That double bind consists in the fact that the masters exclude the others through this epistemic racism for being inferior, right? And so if you come from a supposedly inferior group and you master the language of mastery, to the masters, this proves that you are inferior.
Yes.
Because you have to speak like the master and be like the master. You have to reject your own way of being and speaking.
Yeah.
So we're constantly in this double bind. You know, those of us who are non-white are constantly in this double bind. Yeah. We can't speak how we would like to speak, right? But there's no way out. And if we see what's happening in the UK, and here I'm speaking as a UK citizen, where we have the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and we have ministers in his government who are also of Indian ancestry, and they speak appropriate, normative, I'd say even upper class, in white terms, upper class English, right? They are still lesser. I mean, Rishi Sunak only got to be Prime Minister because Boris Johnson didn't. Right?
Yeah.
So he had already run for Prime Minister, and he was considered to be the best candidate, but he was not white, right? So I think in what's hidden behind the whole discussion of appropriateness, or what is always hidden when we come to this in language, is racism, epistemic racism.
Yes.
So it's not just a variation of subjects who may be black, white, or yellow. The problem of what we consider to be standard language and appropriateness is always white-centric. And that is something which has to be changed.
And male, I might add. This reminds me of this. Sometimes people from the subcontinent come to the United States for higher education. And I think a pet peeve is when people say to them, "Oh, you speak English better than I do." And it's kind of a sideways insult, really, of the kind that you're talking about. Of I guess I really like the mastering the language of mastery. Yeah.
There are a lot of comments and a lot of hands raised, but I want to read two questions in the chat box, and then we'll come to those who have raised up their hands. So Michael has a question about standardization, and I think Michael is wondering, what is the process for standardization for minoritized languages? What should count as standard in this context in light of language variation? They are like in all natural languages. I didn't get the last part of the question, but I think it's about language standardization in minoritized groups. Should I read the question again?
Yeah.
Okay. So in a related vein, one can also wonder about standardization processes for minoritized languages. So Michael's question is, what should count as standard in these contexts in light of language variation?
Yeah. I guess maybe if Michael is here, I would love to hear like an example, because I have like a zillion kind of like different examples flying through my brain right now, but I don't know if any of them are exactly what he's getting at.
Yeah.
Are you here?
Michael?
Could I intervene for a second?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay, the question has partially to do with what's standard, and I just want to throw out a few points. Standardness, the state of a language variety as being standard, is a social fact. Whether it is a material fact has been debated. I would say yes, it's a material fact, but within the context of fuzzy sets. In other words, the boundaries are very fuzzy. But standardness is a social fact. The other thing, what's a standard? Languages go through the standardization process, sometimes over centuries, sometimes within a relatively short period. For example, with the state of Israel when it was founded, etc. And it's based on codification, a set of texts that are considered to exemplify the standard, dictionaries, grammar books, and things like that. So, for example, a number of states now are in the process of standardizing their languages, and some have done so recently. So, as a social fact, that's the beginning of the state, so to speak, of a language varieties being standard. So we could look at it that way. But social facts are crucially dependent on acceptance. Okay. So for example, Haiti has a language academy. The languages has been standardized for all practical purposes, but is Haitian accepted as a standard language throughout the world in the international community? So even social facts have, what should I say, constraining factors. I hope that provides a little bit of background for that notion of standardizing, and standard is something that I happen to have worked on for a little bit over the past few decades.
Yeah. That's very helpful. I don't know. I feel like what counts as standardized is also a moving target, despite all these, like the fuzzy sets, I guess this gets at, despite all the attempts to like nail it down. Language is like something alive that is going to be always changing. So even when something like when and also as soon as something gets standardized, I feel like there's something dangerous about that. I like other than people are going to be in trouble for not following something. But and as even if something has a label like I don't know, Haitian, I feel like I'm thinking of like African American vernacular English, where people sort of take ownership of something as soon as it gets standardized and feel like they're the masters of that, and the judgments about what who gets to count as a speaker or an appropriate speaker, things like that. But I don't know. There's so many hands up. I don't want to keep babbling.
Yeah. So, Zhao, I want to read another question in the chat, and then I'll call on other people. Zhao has a question. Can we interpret appropriateness here as fully legitimized? Those are the lower part of the established hierarchy for either gender, for either their race, their gender, the color of their skin, have never been fully legitimized to behave and to be respected as those at the top of this established hierarchy. So no matter what they do or how closely they speak and behave as those privileged and legitimized, they will be attacked as illegal. Unfortunately, the rules and entitlements of legitimacy are established by those standing on the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if there's a comment or a question, but yeah.
I like that comment, and it seems like the person is feeling something there, which I get. It's so frustrating. I feel the frustration in their typing into the chat that comment.
Yes, and I'm a GAC student here. Thank you for the chance for me to voice my opinion. I just thought the whole thing is about we fear that we are unfairly treated to our access to our full legitimacy to use our own language and to voice our own opinion in our own preferred way. So I think we are often policed. We are often denied our legitimacy, no matter how hard we try to, behave like those privileged. And this kind of hierarchy, actually, the established privileged, they have this hierarchy, and we are those suppressed by this hierarchy. And yeah, I feel a little bit glooming about this. So I think the underlying logic of this is legitimacy. We are not legalized to do what we do as those privileged. I think that's why sometimes we can feel very infuriated about this.
Yeah, I'm hearing it. I feel like, thank you so much for speaking up, because I feel like this is something that Yumi's article about like ELF speakers in the classroom kind of really gets at, that they aren't heard and they aren't seen as negotiating meaning in the same way that other students are always negotiating meaning in classrooms. And I feel like this is something like in higher education, which is like my realm now, I guess, like that's a place where the rubber hits the road for me. Like I as a professor and the person who's like the most legitimate in my own classroom, I guess, I feel like, it's very easy to not hear and see certain people and to hear and see others very vividly. And those are based on my own positionality, of course. And like once somebody like Yumi points out the kind of detailed dynamics of classroom interaction that are happening, that can actually foreground voices that people not only don't hear or see, but criticize and complain about all the time, like then things can be way more interesting and hopefully not frustrating for a lot of students and humans. Yeah.
Thank you. Khadija has her hands raised. Khadija, you can ask a question.
Everyone. So I have 3 questions, if we can consider it as a question. I want to jump on what Mr. Marconi and you were talking about at the beginning on dress and some other thing. I don't know if you hear it, but from now the head of all the new paper in France is the interdiction of wearing abaya for the young girl here.
Yeah.
And in the fashion movement, we see that a lot of girls now claim to wear some modest dress, and it's sometimes a wide clothes, very large dress and long dress. Why this will be different from an abaya?
Yeah.
Like you can be a teenager. You don't want maybe to show leg or to show arm or to show your stomach. I don't know, but it don't make you like a terrorist, And it's a big talk in France, and you talk about this appropriateness. And for the second thing, it was Mr. Spears who talked about it, about the white boy who just come and say, yeah, like, how dare you give me a B? And sometimes, and I'm okay with Mrs. Chen, because sometimes I feel it here in France. Sometimes I'm in class and I hear some reflection and I say, what she or he talking about? But the professor like looks so amazed. And sometimes it's not self-righteousness, but sometimes I know that my worth. I know that I'm not like, I have something in my head. And sometimes I write, I make a dissertation and they give me like a 12 or a 50 and they give them an 18. And I said, no, I think it's not fair. Maybe I feel like they say you can be in our country and think that you have the audacity to think that you will be openness, you know. Sometimes I feel like that, because I say like, how can she just put some good marks, because I know when I have a good, when I do a good job, you know. And I feel like even if I work twice, even if I work harder, I will never be recognized as my value. I will always be seen as less maybe intelligent or less worthy because I'm not really in my country, you know. And I put it in the chat. You talk about some women talking like a man, and I answer that even if we try, we will never be seen like we see a man who talk like, yeah, let me just a second, or no, who give his opinion. A man who give his opinion will always see maybe at sexy, at have some authority. But a woman, when a woman do that, she's bossy, she's not feminine, she want to be a man so bad, and sometimes we just have to excuse ourselves to be, it's not bossy, but if I want to see something, I have the right to put some boundaries, you know, not because I'm a woman or a man, but because it's some human interaction.
Yeah.
For me, it's like normal, you know. And and to end, because I start to speak a little bit too much, it's a double standard when a non-European speak an European language, because some European will be amazed that you speak so well French without any accent. They say, oh my God, but you talk without accent. I thought that you were born here. How can you? It's, for me, it's a bad amaze, you know. You don't have to be amazed that I speak this language so well. Sometimes I just say it's normal because you colonize my people, so it's normal for me to talk your language, you know. And sometimes they turn red. I'm sorry to offend you, but it's right. And for me, some African or some Asian or some Indian who talk English, they always be mocked because they have some accent. But French people who speak English with a very, very bad accent, we see, oh, the French accent, who speak the Frenchy, oh, it's so sexy, it's so charming, you know. But in the other sense, it's like, oh, they don't speak well, they have accent, oh, it's so bad to listen to them. Even in French, when an English man speak French, they say, oh, I like it when someone from London speak English. They have this little accent, some British accent. But me, when a Senegalese man will talk French with his accent, it will be, they don't want to be the part of us. They want to keep their African part, and they don't want to be like us. Yeah, that was my contribution. I'm sorry if I
no, awesome.
If I take a lot of time.
I love it. I love everything you said. I think it's so great. I feel like these are like I only could give like 8 examples of the way these like double standards like fly all over the place. And you just gave like maybe like 10 more that are like fantastic. And it just shows how like, oh, this vicious circle is so powerful, and it just gets people wrapped up in it, unless, like you were saying, you feel like I don't know, as a very strong individual, you feel compelled to bust the vicious circle and say your piece because it's important. Or, I mean, I think that is a very important move. And I also think we have to, as researchers, I guess, scholars, intellectuals, whatever we are, teachers, we have to listen to those voices all the time instead of just sort of making something up. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to. Scott has a question. Scott.
Oops.
We can't hear you.
We want to.
Sorry. Okay, just skip me.
Yes.
Just go to the next person then.
We can hear
Sorry.
you now. We can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. I wanted to, I was just saying thank you for the presentation. Really enjoyed it, Dr. Rymes. Really great presentation and conversation. I wanted to shift gear slightly to try to talk now about how to interrupt this vicious cycle. We had a presentation a while back, about over a year and a half now in this forum on citizen sociolinguistics. And it was critiqued from sort of 2 directions. Mostly the concept of citizenship to begin with talks about sort of people who are included and people who are not, and especially researching areas where there's high levels of migration and high levels of people without papers, without documents, etc., to use the idea of citizens doing this work could potentially be sort of, you know, augur ill for that kind of method. And the other sort of stream of that critique was that it might be a way, although of course it's very researcher specific, to kind of create the illusion that we're just hearing directly from the people. And you can do a lot of ideological work, of course, as a researcher by kind of molding and shaping, you know, what the citizens say about language. So it kind of, it seems as if, you know, one would, in doing citizen sociolinguistics, you would have to do a lot of working through your own positionality and what you were doing then. As a linguist in that context. So I just wanted to hear, because I'm thinking of using it in something I'm busy working on at the moment. So I was just wondering what your approach was. Why do you think that citizen sociolinguistics is a way to break this vicious cycle?
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. That is like a thing that's so vexing to me, that yes, I totally get the idea that it can sound very naive, like this idea of like, oh, we're just like gung-ho citizens going out there gathering language data from the people and then using it to do our same old thing that we always do. But for me, I feel like my version of citizen sociolinguistics is this more radical epistemic shift in terms of where the locus of expertise is and where even the questions should be coming from. So, and I think this is this kind of, for me, this citizen sociolinguistics comes out of this sort of awe and wonder in the face of language diversity in all its contexts. And this is something that sounds a bit, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so maybe the flip side of that awe and wonder is another thing that I call like citizen sociolinguistic arrests, which is like this policing of language that people self-appoint themselves as those police and do it all the time. Those are also citizen sociolinguists. There's the people who are like, awestruck with the language and their finite knowledge of how language works in this tiny little niche, like all the things that we just heard about, the way like a Senegalese person speaks French and blah, 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 like all those details that people don't care about, or the details like about ways people speak in South Philadelphia that nobody here at the University of Pennsylvania, despite studying the English in South Philadelphia for decades, knows about. Like, so there's this sort of awe in the sort of finite details of how we use different varieties to participate with each other, but then there's also the sort of arrest side of citizen sociolinguistics, where people criticize each other in harsh and horrible ways, like all those people criticizing the Indian American spelling bee winners. They feel somehow entitled to do that. So that's, but I don't see as citizen sociolinguistics just crowdsourcing, you know, like, oh, tell me like what languages you hear in your area and let's make an app about it. That does not seem very interesting to me or epistemically revolutionary in any way. So I agree with that. And not to plug myself too much, but I did write this book about, I happen to have it right here. It's called How We Talk About Language. And it has a chapter in it about this term citizen. And I sort of tried and unpack it a little bit in my own version of citizen sociolinguistics way, the way this word citizen circulates and takes on different, means different things in different communities and things like that is super interesting in and of itself. So, but I highly support your desire to like figure out what are the interesting aspects of being a citizen sociolinguist, and what are the potential places where you have I have blind spots, or any researcher does. Seems really important also. But I think another antidote to those blind spots is doing collaborative work with different types of people. It's like so crucial. That's why I think this is really cool, even though I almost never can come on Friday mornings, but I think this is like a great forum for that type of thinking.
Yeah. Sangeeta also has a question. Sangeeta.
So thank you, Betsy. This was really very, very interesting. And I particularly liked the way in which you framed the issue of moving targets. I think that's a good reminder to all of us in how we recycle and how categories circulate. And that was one of the three questions I had. This is related to how you are infusing debunked and problematized categories, at least in some parts of the language sciences. And that is code switching and multimodality. You're infusing them with new meanings. And so that first question is, do you see some risks in doing that? A second question that comes up with what you very rightly take up with the mother tongue too point is that, isn't there a risk that these unmarked naturalized norms seep into this norms of monolingualism, continue to seep into our imaginaries when we are within this mainstream framework? So one way in which I read into your inspiring talk is that you talk about this looking at the naturalized norms. So when you're talking about the spelling bee example, I wonder if anthropologists, instead of studying the languaging repertoires of people from other continents who have moved to North America, if they start looking at what white previous winners, what their repertoires are. So that is one. And the other, also shift our gaze to the normal languaging and what I call the normal diversities of other continents to understand the paucity of the scholarship that reproduces norms. So that was the second one. And the third one relates to your use of the word home. I feel worried because homes are not always these safe spaces. I'm thinking of deaf children. 95% of deaf children are born into hearing families. So Swedish Sign Language is not the safe languaging repertoire there. Or when you have so-called mixed race families where a number of languages, and we are not even getting into the issue of sociolects and dialects of people who live in. So those were the three issues I was keen to hear on, and because these are things I grapple with. So one was your use of the debunked categories of code switching and multimodality. The other was is it time that we focus on the unmarked naturalized norms and instead look at communities and people who are normal, who have normal languaging repertoires and normal diversities. And the third was this focus on home. And thank you once again. This was very, very interesting.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for these three really important points. I'm going to start with the third one and then go to the second one and then the first one, because the first one's most confusing. Okay, so home, I totally agree. I meant it in the way it always gets invoked in these discussions of appropriateness. It's like, oh, that's your home language. Like home is a place where you can do whatever and it's like totally fine and comfortable. And I totally agree that home is not like some sanctuary away from society. It's like a place where these things get played out also. And it's such a complicated place. So I see that as, I have a critical stance towards idealizing home, definitely, along with you. In terms of mother tongue plus two, and looking at naturalized norms of people who've already, you know, like speak the power language or something, I guess is what you're talking about. Looking at the winners, you're saying, sort of the language of I think this is great. I mean, I feel like I've spent a lot of time at this like relatively privileged suburban high school, doing like fun language awareness activities with the students. And it's just, they are the winners in like an honors English of a suburban high school. And in many respects, they're the winners, but like, they also, so I think I think it's interesting to study that, and also to not always be, I guess, reifying marginalization by having that be our main focus of study. Especially as a white person, I feel like, oh, I'm at that, when I go to that high school, I feel like I'm almost doing like insider ethnography, seeing like, oh, what my people are doing. And it's very interesting. So you're saying in terms of paucity of scholarship, is this what you're talking about? The paucity of scholarship of the winners?
Yeah, so 15 years ago, I won a Swedish Research Council project where we were sending in doctoral students into the design was to send them into 5 different types of schools, one of which was a so-called deaf school, one was a so-called multicultural with a lot of immigrants, the Swedish-Finnish school, and then we wanted to look at a so-called monolingual white Swedish schools. And obviously I knew that there are no such schools, right. But our 2 authorities, national authorities, actually spent 6 months trying to locate them in the far north of Sweden, which was also bizarre, but that was of course one of the point being that looking at what is the invisible then allows us to interrogate what all of us seem to be trying to do. So I use the concepts normal languaging to point to spaces on the planet and to point to the normality of using a a very broad range of repertoires. Even when people claim that they are monolingual, they know how to talk to carpenters differently than to their family members, etc., etc. So that was the point. But it is bizarre that we are so fixated as educational scholars looking at problems.
Yeah.
So we go into bilingual schools or multilingual spaces in order to understand what is actually normal in a number of parts of the planet. So that was the point. And
Yeah.
if I'll just comment what you said about home languages, I mean, there is this very important problem. In Sweden, we have shifted from home language to mother tongue and mother tongue to home language, and there has been this discussion, but both spaces are gendered. So there is that added problem of being marginalized by looking at women's spaces as where, so the whole,
Yes.
In Swedish, the term used is mother food. So modersmål, mother food, it is not mother tongue.
Oh.
And then of course you have this point of that signs languages are not in the mouth, they're in the hands, they're embodied, a point that Lynn Mario made, so there are all those layers that could inform us through the vocabularies that so I was coming from that point of, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I just picked up a book, and I only read the last chapter so far, but it's called Mother Tongue. It's about these, just about the history of women's words, that you might really get a kick out of it. And it relates to these things completely that you're talking about. Of course, it's about the English language, but it's just basically a huge book, a book full of infinite numbers of interesting things about words about women. So you might like that. But also I was thinking, I love your description about if we look at sort of these normal discourse, it made me think of like Yumi Matsumoto's work on international students speaking ELF at the university, and how they do these complicated negotiations of meaning. And I feel like being at a high school with the types of kids that end up going to our university, I see these are mostly white privileged kids. They do these same kinds of negotiations of meaning all the time because, as you say, they speak a variety of Englishes and very different from their teachers. And their teachers all have different ways of speaking and norms for their classrooms. And the kids like seamlessly move through those and have critiques of the finest grained variations within that supposedly universally acceptable way of speaking English. So I think that's super interesting. The first, and also points to, well, anyway, the first thing you said about infusing legitimacy or reviving debunked categories such as code switch, and I only invoked multimodality for a second, but I wouldn't actually ever use that word because I just found it annoying. But code switch, I think, is very mysterious to me. I guess this is another thing I think that happens once you take this, you start listening to how everyday people who aren't linguists or anthropologists or sociolinguists, when you start listening to how everyday people talk about language, they have a lot of words like that we use and they kind of mean different things. Like code switch was completely intertwined in the language of teachers at this high school that I mentioned in the talk. And they have a very specific way of using it, and even as like a command, like if somebody's coming into the classroom and saying like, "You irking me," or speaking in a certain way, the teacher will say like, "Hey, code switch." And it has nothing to do with how I think any linguist or sociolinguist would talk about it. They really use it as a way of saying like, "Hey, like get more formal and polite right now." and it can come off as saying be white. So I don't know exactly, I wouldn't say reviving that, but I think it's like any kind of term or category that we come up with as like scholars, it takes on a life of its own no matter what. And so it's more interesting to me to sort of see what that life is, and where it goes, than to just like stop using it, except for in the case of multimodality, which I just find annoying.
Yeah. So there are more questions, but we want to, Salikoko can ask, and then we'll end the formal session with Salikoko's question.
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you, Betsy. I'm so happy I didn't miss this talk. And there are things that you, in your position as a white person, can say that if I or others said it, people would say, you are bitching, look where you are, and so forth. And so about a month ago, I posted to my Facebook an article about language, and it said, academia has a problem, and that problem is language. It's like an elephant in the room that people don't really want to talk about, in the sense that editors edit submissions or have reviewed submissions by non-native speakers more severely than they do submissions by native speakers and so forth.
Yeah.
And after listening to you today, I would like somebody to write in an article, there's another problem in academia, and that problem is race. And I'll give you two personal anecdotes. About 10 months ago, I attended a meeting of the American Philosophical Society. It was for my induction. And
Here in Philadelphia.
After somebody's presentation, in an unusual way, my hand went up. And now that I remember, in the audience, there were about 3 or 4 blacks. So you would think that a black hand would stand out and that the person fielding the questions wouldn't miss it. I waited and waited and waited until somebody near me, a white guy, said, but this hand has been up for the longest. And then the person fielding the question said, oh, we are running out of time. So I didn't have a chance to ask my question. And so it's different anecdote is that I have been criticized of writing in a complicated way in English. And so there's a book that I'm revising now. And one of the comments that I received is, the language is too vernacular.
Oh.
It should be, I thought this person would compliment me for just trying to correct a problem that I have lived with. And now instead of writing in some way that reflects my early academic training in French rather than in English, with shorter sentences, things that are quite straightforward, this particular reviewer didn't like that. So I can't win. And these are the kinds of things that we face regularly. So we can be at meetings and you have an alternative analysis, and your color becomes a factor because there is an expectation that if you don't follow the received doctrine, there must be something wrong with you. There must be something that you wouldn't understand because of your race. Totally. Or is it something else? Okay, so it doesn't matter how accomplished you become, you still face these kinds of reactions to the things that you do. So I guess you can articulate it more this race dimension more forcefully in your work. I'm really glad that your paper connects, helps us understand that reactions to appropriate language or inappropriate language are just proxies to individuals, to particular groups, and not really reactions to language practice per se.
Oh, it's the worst feeling. I feel you, as we say in Philadelphia. But I think also I love and also hate your example of them saying that suddenly saying your writing is too dense, and then saying it's too vernacular. I feel like it's a perfect example of the moving target. Like it's not about anything that's real about how you're writing. It's kind of an imagined idea of some form that it isn't taking, and kind of goes full circle back to Professor Spear's experience with his paper that got a B, which was an A paper, I'm sure. I have a feeling, going out on a limb. But like I just think that somehow the human aspect of this moving target thing is so painful, and I feel like there's it's so important.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And so we could see that all these things are resonating with people in different ways at different places, and the conversation has been very engaging. But we'd like to end the formal session here and stop recording. And for those who are interested in staying and discussing more, we could discuss. So I'd like to